Hi, my name is Lauren Kreutzinger, Senior Manager at Von Lehman CPA and Advisory Firm. I'd like to thank our partners on this series, Fraternal and Favor and Company. This live stream will be recorded and available on our events website after the event. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will send the presenters' information out after the event in case you have follow-up questions. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer and Mark Morris.
Thank you, Lauren. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Morris. I serve as the Executive Vice President for Favor and Company.
And I'm Jennifer Morris, and I currently serve as Senior Account Executive for Favor and Company.
We're going to go ahead and dive right into the presentation here. I'm going to share my screen, and we will be off and running. Hopefully everybody can see that fine. And Jennifer, I'll kick it to you.
Sure. Well, Mark and I have both been in the industry since the mid-90s, we'll say, when we both traveled as consultants for our respective organizations. As you can see, we've been working with fraternities and sororities our entire career, either as volunteers, as professionals on our staff, or as partners to your organization. We also have a daughter who is currently in Alpha Chi at the University of Iowa, and she has served as social chair and also as vice president of facility operations. So we have real life experience in these areas with the types of students that you all are working with today.
So just to give you a little background about Favor and Company and what we do, for about 40 years now, the Favor Agency has been servicing the business insurance needs of college-based fraternal organizations. Our agency's profits and priorities really center on helping our clients reduce the frequency and severity of claims, which can help preserve the insurance marketplace that we've set up with Lloyd's of London, where we're actually cover holder. And a cover holder basically means that we do all of the underwriting, all the policy issuance, all the policy manuscript forms, all in-house, everything kind of soup to nuts, which is a great advantage for our clients. As far as our fraternal health and safety initiative, which you can see there on the screen, we spend a considerable amount of money every year helping our clients figure out ways to educate not only their undergraduate members, but their house corporations and other chapter advisory board members and other volunteers on risk management and health and safety. You know, one of the first things that we do on each presentation is we talk about the risk management process. And real quickly, there's 5 steps to this process. The first one is exposure identification. And we can't really start the risk management process without understanding what our exposures are. So this is really the most important step, is identifying areas of exposure. And those are things like alcohol, hazing, sexual assaults, fires, embezzlement, all those types of things that we're going to talk about today. The second step, which is analysis and evaluation, we've kind of done some of that for you here today. The presentation that we put together. So you'll see some of that, and we're highlighting that to help you then reduce and control those exposures as the third step. And that's really where we'll be focusing the majority of our time today. The last 2 steps, the fourth step, is where Favor and Company and our partners out there come in from an insurance standpoint to help you finance potential losses, whether that's through an insurance program or through your own internal financing. And the last step is kind of the implementing and monitoring of the process. Really, that's where we're training, retraining, educating, and reviewing the whole risk management process. And then we start over with exposure identification. You know, ultimately, the goal here is to work within the industry to help the protection of each organization's assets. And so, in our opinion, those assets include protecting the mothership, which is the national entities, as well as the staff, the volunteers, and of course your individual members, chapters, house corporations, and other groups within your organization.
So taking that concept of risk control from the third step, we're going to talk about what it is, how we do it, and how is it going to relate to the items you're going to put on the operational checklist that you're building throughout this series related to health and safety for your organization. We're going to talk about the common exposures that we've identified based on what's our core business as organizations, and then we've got some time at the end for Q&A. So risk control, once you've identified your exposures, we want to minimize the opportunity for risk in the areas. And we can do this in 5 different ways. You can avoid a risk entirely. Let's say you're trying to reduce the risk of an auto accident. You can avoid that risk by simply not driving your car. So that's a very basic example. Prevention, how do we prevent an auto accident type risk? Well, we've got stop signs and stop lights. Mechanisms are put in place to try to prevent the situation from occurring at all. Reduction, reducing the severity of an auto accident. We want our participants wearing seatbelts. Segregation, separation, duplication. So let's go for a different example and think about your own business operations or the operations of a larger business. How do we separate out the risk? Maybe you have 2 separate buildings that have employees or your main business operations split out, so that if one goes down, let's say it burns down or is hit by a tornado, you can carry on operations elsewhere. And then finally, transferring the risk. This is where you work with your third-party vendor partners. Maybe you outsource some of your services or some of your operations, and we will address some of those throughout our topics today too. So you're going to see examples of a lot of these throughout the checklist items that we're going to encourage you to put on your operational checklist. So the common exposures we've identified for you really fall into 2 primary areas, and then we've added a third. So your human resources, your people, as well then is your property. And this is the core of what we do. We're a membership organization, and we house a lot of people in those different chapter areas. So that's the main focus for today. We've also split out the cyber exposure for you. Cyber, we're going to put that under people, but I think it deserves its own special classification today because this is a really changing and emerging area of risk and something you're going to want to review on a pretty regular basis. And what you're going to review in that process is also going to change, and that's probably going to be driven by your cyber insurance providers and their requirements for insurance. So let's first talk about our people, our human resources. And the people are probably our greatest area of risk within our organization. Again, it's what we do as fraternities and sororities. So we've got a couple different buckets of people. We've got our employees, we have our boards and our board members. We've got volunteers, and we have chapters and house corporations, you know, their officers and what they do within those organizations in their roles. So we're going to take each one of these buckets and talk about them separately. So let's go to employees first. So the most common thing you can think of right off the bat are going to be physical injuries to your employees. So on your checklist, you want to have a record of the work environment that your employees are in. So, you know, in your building, for example, take a look at slip, trip, fall concerns. You know, is there anywhere where an employee is going to have that physical injury, falling down, you know, wet floors? How do you address those things? The next section is really important, especially post-pandemic, and that's going to be ergonomics, prolonged computer use. You know, we've got people sitting for a lot longer than they used to. We also have remote workers now sitting and working at home. And so they're still your workers. So you have to think about what tools are you giving them so that they can work safely in their environment. I was watching a video from a physical therapist just talking. I've got my own, you know, back pain to think about. But since the pandemic, you know, we've got people that are, you know, working on their couches, right? So we're not all in the best posture. And that's really causing problems from a neck and back standpoint for a lot of people who primarily work in front of their computer. So take that into consideration as you're reviewing work environments for your employees. Drug and alcohol use is something that can be an exposure. So if you are doing any type of drug and alcohol testing for employees, or if you're doing background checks, consult with your legal counsel before you execute on those. State laws, you know, will always vary, and you're going to want to make sure that you get that opinion that what you're doing is not going to cause you additional risk in your employment practices if you're taking on those activities. And finally, workers' comp insurance item for your checklist. When you hire or terminate an employee, make sure you're adding an item there that you have to notify your workers' comp insurance provider. So sometimes, you know, we don't find out about new employees or terminated employees until renewal. Don't wait that long. Just make that a part of your regular hire or have someone who's no longer your employee. And remember that workers' comp responses for remote workers are really going to vary by state. This has become, again, post-pandemic, a really interesting area that's changing and that's being litigated. So again, checking with your legal counsel on what might apply, especially if you're bringing somebody onto your staff that is in a state where you have not had an employee before. And there are some states where you have to go through the state workers' comp pool to get coverage. So for example, in Ohio, you have to get that coverage on your own. Your provider, like Favor & Company, cannot do that for you. So again, work with your insurance folks and work with your legal team just to make sure you're identifying any special considerations based if you start with a new state. And then employment practices liability. So this is your negligent hiring, firing, training of an employee. So make sure your D&O coverage is adequate. Review your limits annually. Make sure you feel like you have adequate coverage there. Also review your hiring and termination practices with your legal counsel. You don't want to be doing something that's going to get you into a D&O claim situation. And finally, we can transfer the risk. So you could work with an outside provider for your HR needs. I know many fraternity and sororities are doing that. So if you're not, and that's something you're interested in, network among yourselves to see who a good provider is and how you're using that outside partner resource. And finally, crime. I think our friends at Von Lehman had a great slide on internal controls in the first session of our series. So if you've not seen that session, go back and check that out because I was really happy with their slide there on their employee theft controls. Make sure too you're adding something to your checklist that you've got all your chapters and house corporations having some sort of regular training in this area. What's the requirement for if they're still using check signing? How are they just accounting for all the internal controls that need to take place? I know we often just think about our internal office employees, but they are handling a lot of dollars there also. So they have to be trained on how to do this. And we're going to talk about just kind of the phishing emails and fraudulent money transfers under our cyber topic area. So let's move on to our next group of people, and that's our boards and our boards members. So they're responsible, make sure they're engaged properly for the audit review, and that item's on your calendar and on your checklist for board meetings. Make sure that's scheduled in, and that your audit committee, if you have one of those, is working on a proper schedule. Our friends at Fraternal Law, I think, are going to address all the corporate governance documents in their session, so we won't go into detail there, but that still is an item that needs to be calendared out and reviewed on a regular basis. And reviewing all of your policies and procedures. Make sure you're putting a calendar together so that you're reviewing your organization's policies and procedures on a regular basis. Schedule out staff time for doing that, and then schedule how does that look on your board calendars if there are items that the board has to review and approve. Make sure on the health and safety policy review, you're doing that twice a year. And there might not be any changes, mid-year review, or there might be based on recommendations from your insurance provider. So just having that item on your every 6-month checklist will ensure that you're capturing those things as they come up, in your email box or things you learn from a conversation with your provider. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about that policy procedure that's most applicable to our presentation, and that is health and safety.
Make sure I unmute myself there. When we talk about health and safety pieces, Jennifer's right. You want to make sure that you have your board checklist where you're reviewing those policies every 6 months. And not only are you having your board review those, but you're also sending them out to your chapters, your undergraduate members, and all of your volunteers to make sure that they are all squared away and understand and are signing off on those policies. Most of these policies that we have for you today are going to be pretty basic. You've seen them all before. You want to make sure your policies are prohibiting the following: the physical, mental, and emotional hazing, underage consumption of alcohol, and excessive overconsumption by members. Basically, you want to make sure that they're following the state law. The presence of alcohol and illegal substances at all recruitment or new member activities and events. We don't like to see that. Other items here include the presence or consumption of any hard alcohol that's above 15% alcohol by volume at any chapter facility, event, or activity. The NIC and I believe the NPC as well has this policy built into their risk management, standard risk management policies, where hard alcohol can only be used at a third-party vendor location and only then purchased individually by those that are of age to consume alcohol. The next piece is on physical altercations, physical assaults, those intentional acts, fights, those types of things. And last here is the presence of and usage of illegal drugs and or substances. A piece here, I get questions from undergraduate members when we're doing presentations at various events about the use of marijuana, as some states do allow marijuana to be purchased and used. And right now, our stance is, because it's still against the federal law, we recommend that all fraternities and sororities do not allow any use of marijuana at a chapter event or being held on chapter property, because it is still against federal law. Of course, you also want policies that prohibit sexual misconduct, sexual abuse, and sexual assault. That is a growing area of concern from a claim standpoint. Those claims are becoming more and more expensive, as you can imagine, with the Me Too movement and the focus on these types of claims on college campuses today, not just in fraternities and sororities, but in many other groups. That is an area of growing concern and focus. Discrimination kind of goes without saying, and other high-risk events and activities. When we talk about high risk, we're talking about severe events like boxing events. Even though they're done for charity and have some good intention, a lot of times they're organized not in the best manner and can lead to serious injury or even death. We've had a couple of deaths over the last several years resulting from these charity boxing events. Other high-risk events would include water-related activities, things like slip and slides or water skiing. Of course, you have your standard things like bungee jumping or skydiving, or some of those more severe. We have a full, if anybody would like to see that, on high-risk events. Open parties is something that we frown on. You want to make sure that you know who is coming to your events, whether it's, and you also want to limit the type of person coming to your event. You don't want your high school students or non-college students attending your event. You can have up to 2 to 3 members per undergraduate member on a guest list to make sure that the party has some controls built in. Also, the presence of firearms or fireworks at chapter events and on chapter property. We like to have policies prohibiting that. And many of you recall back in the 80s when groups were prevalent, and we had some concerns there with Little Sisters and other auxiliary groups causing issues as it relates to membership in those organizations. Pledge associate member and new member sneaks, pledge skips, kidnappings, or other required visits. You want to be careful with anything that relates to travel, especially out of town definition or destination. And then one of the other important things is when your chapters are engaging and signing contracts and things, you want to be careful that they're not assuming any contractual liability on behalf of the general fraternity organization. We always commonly recommend that chapters only sign agreements in the name of their chapter and not in the name of their international or national organization. Newer forms of policies that many groups are starting to build are social media policies that will limit the potential for harming, harassing, or defaming or embarrassing others. And a newer one is prohibiting the use of drones. We've had a couple of claims that have resulted in accidents from drones not being piloted correctly. So that is a growing concern there as well, especially in relation to violations of privacy when they're used to spy or use cameras and things into windows and places where they shouldn't be looking. And then other additional things that are up for consideration, we encourage our clients to limit the number of events with alcohol per semester, especially until those members, undergraduate members, have completed their annual risk management and health and safety educational programming, especially coming out of COVID, where we've lost a couple of years worth of passing the torch, so to speak, from older members that had planned these events. Now they're gone and graduated, and younger members who didn't have the experience of planning and sometimes even attending these events are faced with trying to do this themselves for the first time. So that basic 101 risk management, health and safety educational programming is critical. That was more important last year, but still, as we enter the school year again, it's always a good reminder to make sure they're completing their annual educational programming. And last but not least, a policy promoting the importance of human dignity, decency, and diversity.
Okay, so going back then to some of the other things that would be helpful for your board member checklist. Our boards are responsible for hiring and evaluating the chief executive officer. When you're in that hiring process, make sure you have some set interview questions. Don't let your team who's asking those deviate from the list and ask some questions that are not on the list. We've seen some cases where maybe there's some inappropriate questions being asked that then puts you in a D&O, again, claim situation. This is another great place to engage a third party to help you with the process. Again, transferring some of that risk and having someone who professionally experienced in this area set up your interview questions, coach everyone through the process, and make sure that everything is done well. Annual review of the CEO. Make sure you've got a set review schedule and a process for that person that's fair, that will help you, again, stay out of a negligent supervisory or evaluation type claim. And does your CEO know how and on what he or she's being evaluated? So a couple things to consider if your board doesn't have that as part of its regular operational calendar. And then the employment of the CEO related to employment issues, again, is your CEO well equipped to handle or delegate them? If not, consider or ensure that your CEO is provided with some educational opportunities or appropriate resources. And make sure that the CEO understands that there's clarity what he or she has the authority to do and what items need board approval. So it's really good to know who is responsible for approving what, so that nothing slips through the cracks, and again, everyone's on the same page when it comes to types of decisions, especially when they involve things like investments, buying and selling property, so those large financial decisions.
The next group that we wanted to chat about is our chapters and house corporations. And one of the biggest categories that happens, that's never a good thing for our organizations when you have to close a chapter. That usually means that something's gone wrong, but you want to make sure you have your standard procedures set. You want to be prepared ahead of time for those. So a checklist for closing a chapter includes notification. One of the first things you want to do is notify your insurance provider, because we have had situations literally where we'll get a strange phone call from an undergraduate member asking some pretty pointed questions about coverage issues and things of that nature. And had we not heard from our partner clients from the CEO about that chapter has been closed, it could cause concern there. So vacancy planning also for any facility, we can help you with that. There's insurance coverages that need to be adjusted and on that side. Other notification procedures, you want to notify your alumni and alumni, making them aware. Of course, if you're not already engaged with your host institution about what has happened with that chapter, you want to notify them. And if you do have a chapter facility, it's great to notify local law enforcement to help with the security of that facility, just so they can keep an eye on it, because nobody should be there. Other things on your checklist for closing a chapter, you want to address with your students the use of trademarks. That includes the fraternity or sorority name as well as the chapter name. You want to secure your ritual equipment. One of the other critical areas to focus on is the finances. Do you have a procedure or a protocol in place for handling how those chapter finances are going to be handled? Are you going to close the bank accounts? Is there outstanding monies due to the international entity? Are there other bills that are owed to for utilities, for example, or other bills for the university that you need to satisfy? If there is a chapter facility, you could consider hiring professional security to lock down the facility to prevent vandalism. Depending on how the chapter was closed, we have had some serious claims in the past from vandalism. You can hire a property manager to come in and evaluate the facility and tell you what needs to be done in order to lease that facility in the future. And of course, simple things like changing locks.
So also in the chapter category of people, relationship statements with our host institutions come into play. So here's some checklist items you can think about as you're reviewing these relationship statements. Number one, simply keep an inventory of which of your chapters have a signed agreement with their host institution and when those expire. Some have to be renewed and signed every year, some extend for a longer period of time. Just make sure you have an eye on what that looks like for the chapters that you have. And then do you have a checklist or some sort of process in place on what happens when you get one of these to review? Hopefully you're getting them to review. So do your chapters even know what to do with this document when they receive it? Hopefully they're sending it to you for review assistance and not just signing it because it's put right in front of them, because there are going to be things in there. Some are risk management related, but many of them are not. They're more related to your authority as the international organization, single sex organization type things, Title IX things, membership issues. Are you allowed to select your own members, your recruitment process? We know that those things are all outlined in those agreements. So make sure your chapters know what to do with the document when they receive it. And when on the calendar, do you need to be communicating that to your chapters? Who's the appropriate staff person responsible for reviewing the agreement when it comes in? Or do you have that delegated to a volunteer? Just make sure you've got somebody who has the expertise to review that for you. Who's going to be your point person for any communication with the host institution? In case there are some areas you've got questions about, you need clarification on, anything you're really looking to push back on, how's that going to be communicated? Make sure when you're looking at the relationship statements, you're looking at them with an eye to see if there are any expectations the host institution has of you as the international organization. So sometimes we see things in there that are outside the scope of chapter operations. Maybe they're, asking or they're requiring that you as the inter-organization make sure that the chapter follows the host institution's requirements. You might want to think about the concern that goes along with that. So there are some things that they're obligating you to that you might not be able to or want to agree to do. And then finally, do any of these expectations require assistance from any of your partners? So this would be your legal team, your insurance team. Oftentimes we have to elevate it to the NPC, the NIC level to do some collaborative work and conversation with that specific campus. And we know that there are several of those that are taking place now. So being engaged and just not, you're responding instead of reacting when you have some of these checklist items in place related to these documents. And then finally, communication with our people. We want to think about developing what are your communication priorities each year, and then creating an annual educational planning calendar that then puts those priorities into action. So you can prioritize them, what needs to happen each semester, each month, and we encourage our clients, especially in the area of health and safety, be communicating with their chapters on a weekly basis. Make sure your communication is regular and consistent when you're communicating with chapters, and I would also say house corporations. You also are going to want to have a checklist for special chapter situations in terms of communication. So this is maybe when you find out a chapter has violated an alcohol policy or some other policy procedure of yours. How are you going to address that? Have your process laid out before it happens, or tweak the process you have now so you're ready for the next time. It's always easier to think through this logically when you're not in the middle of that immediate crisis situation. And then finally, invest in your staff and your volunteers when it comes to training and education around all of your topics, but here we're going to emphasize health and safety in particular. So we've actually put together a full communication calendar for our clients for the health and safety issues and provided them with resources. So if you work with us, you should have that. But I wanted to highlight some of the things that we share with our clients for each month in case you're building out your own, and also check with your provider and your broker as well to see what ideas and resources they have. We've started here with August because that's the month we're in and we're gearing up for a new academic year. So how can we communicate with our chapters this month, reminding them of their risk management policies? Do you have a communication piece you want to put out to parents? I know we have a parents guide that we share with our clients that we encourage them to either have posted on their website or send it out to parents so that parents understand the expectations that we as organizations have for the behavior and the choices that our members make, and make sure that they understand what their members are getting into when they join, one of our organizations. We've linked here, and so when you get the handout after this is over, there'll be a link to the resource we have on our website that deals with hazing prevention and intervention. September, great month to communicate now with our advisors and our house corporations if you haven't done that already. We've got new members coming into our organization, so have a touch point with them. This is where you might want to start with your officer-specific communication related to health and safety. You might have something for each, officer planned there. So taking a look at your officer structure and see what might be appropriate. And also having a welcome back to the new school year communication with the fraternity sorority advisor, on your campuses is also a great way to start building that partnership for the year. Moving into October, we're kind of getting into initiation season. If you have initiation earlier than that or later, you can certainly adjust. But now is a good time from a health and safety standpoint to have that communication on your list for the month. Let's talk about alcohol. We've put that in for the month of November, and we have some resources there. And then moving into December, we're getting ready for break. So late November, early December, again, depending upon the academic calendar, the weather's going to change. So we need to get some tips out to how we secure and protect that chapter facility. I know a lot of us across the board really saw some hefty claims, right around the 24th and 25th of December last year. So this is going to be a very important year to get ahead of that. We're having unusual weather in parts of the country that are just not prepared for that type of freeze. And so think now about the communication you're going to put out as we get closer to prepare for those seasons when these facilities are not occupied over those potentially really cold months or weeks, so we can try to start avoiding some of these water damage claims. In January, we talked about before, we mentioned twice a year communicating with our constituents about the risk management policies. So January is the start of a new academic term. This would be a good time to of what those policies are. And then again, we can start off the year with some financial control information. Let's share that with our chapters and house corporations. Many of us elect new officers around this time, so you're going to have that new treasurer, maybe new finance advisor. That team is starting up fresh. So again, the importance of how to prevent theft would be a great piece for you to put out there in January and work with those officers. We're going to kind of start re-rolling that schedule here in February because, again, we might be participating in spring recruitment. So we're going to have new members, officer-specific communication, and then touching base again at the start of this new academic term with our partners at our host institutions. March, we might have initiation again for those spring recruitment new members. April would be a good time. We can put mental health communication in there, or you could have that monthly if you want to. We just wanted to make sure that was captured there at least someplace in your calendar. Again, we want to start thinking about securing and protecting the chapter facility. This time it's for a bit of a different risk. It's warmer, but it's going to be unoccupied for a longer period of time. So what does that look like from that summer month standpoint if there's not going to be anyone in the facility? So we do have a summer break checklist available for your use, on our website if you need something to start. Again, check with your own insurance provider for that. I'm sure they have something. And we've got some more tips there for vacations again as well. It certainly doesn't hurt back in March to even put something out there if the campus has that week off for some type of a spring break. Anytime you have something longer than a long weekend, it's always a great opportunity touch point with your house corporations and your chapter officers. And then in May, I like to start thinking about the next academic year here. And since our students might be leaving campus, this is a great time to do some volunteer training. And let's put some volunteer training on health and safety for the upcoming academic term on the calendar in May. And then finally, we will have a link to any resources that we have on our website that you're welcome to use, especially when it comes to volunteers. We do have a lot of those. And we're going to move to the third bucket of properties and things to add to your checklist there. So this should be, I think, common sense for everyone. We know we do inspections, we work with our clients on facilities, but make sure you've got things on your monthly checklist and your checklist that you need to be looking at. They are as basic as making sure your exit signs are all in good working order, your fire equipment is tested. This is both in your headquarters facility and the chapter facilities. Annually, be sure you are having a professional inspection of the sprinkler system. And this is really important. We'll give you an example as to why we're stressing this with our clients. And this should be for your building, your headquarters building, as well as for your chapter facilities. We had a client who had a claim because of a faulty sprinkler system. It was a over $1 million claim. And it wasn't the house corporation's fault. It was not installed well by the contractor. Unfortunately, the claim took place in a state that had some specific requirements in this area. And we were able to, pay the claim, get the chapter house back in working order, but we did try to subrogate back against the contractor for the sprinkler system. Because the house corporation did not engage in an annual professional inspection of that sprinkler system, they were not able to recover all of the dollars they could have on subrogation because of specific laws in that state. So we're really emphasizing that professional annual inspection with our clients, and so we would encourage you all to go ahead and do the same. Oftentimes with property, it comes with working with subcontractors. We do a lot of renovation and reconstruction and just other services where we're using other people. We'll get calls from house corporations sometimes that they're looking for the best price to use for someone that might be painting a facility or doing other type of work. But sometimes that best price comes along with the fact that that subcontractor is not purchasing their own insurance. So when you are working with a subcontractor, make sure that they have and can show you these workers' comp limits. Make them produce, that certificate showing at least $500,000 in this area and the statutory limits of coverage A. On the next slide, Mark, we've got the general liability limits we want to make sure your subcontractors have. So be sure that they can show you that they have $1 million minimum per occurrence limit in general liability with that $2 million aggregate. You don't want the subcontractors relying on your insurance to pay for any claims for their employees, their subcontractors, any negligence that they might have on your chapter property or your headquarters property when you are working with them. Also in the property area, think about your own business personal property. So let's think about the inventory that's in your headquarters building, and that's also true for the chapter and house corporation on inventory that's in your chapter facility. So keep an inventory of your business personal property, that's your contents, with a replacement cost valuation. You need to know, what you have to know what the right value is to make sure you're adequately insured in this area. And this is everything, desks and chairs and technology equipment, like all of the things that are permanently attached to the walls of the floor in your building. Remembering for chapters that the individual property of our members and the residents are not covered by this. They need their own renter's insurance for that. So make sure you're communicating that out to your chapters and they're understanding that when they're signing agreements, especially at the National Housing Corporation level. But make sure you know what you have and you know what it's valued. So I would say about 4 months prior to your insurance renewal date, we like our clients to make sure they're reviewing this item, their own inventory, and ensuring the values are current. And if they're not, notify the broker. Or you can just put this on autopilot. Our clients use a special service that we have for appraisals. The appraisal company right? We've transferred this obligation over to them. We'll automatically notify our clients it's time for your annual review, and the client will take a look at the inventory of everything in their headquarters. They'll report any changes that happen to the building during the year, and then those appraised values will come back to us as part of their insurance renewal. So you can put those type things on autopilot so that you're not having to do an extensive amount of work on an annual basis. So let someone else help you with that. And then emergency planning. So think about, not just if a chapter house were completely unusable from a tornado or fire, but also your headquarters building. So do you have a backup worksite location identified? Do you know where you can carry on your normal business operations if your building becomes unusable due to a loss? So if you've not investigated that yet, slate that into your checklist and make sure you're reviewing that on an annual basis, because maybe the location you identified last year might not be available to you this year, or it might be cost prohibitive this year. So make sure you're looking at that on at least an annual basis. What's the cost going to be to do that? And are you properly insured for it? So do you have that extra expense insurance? What limit do you have available to you? You might have a blanket limit. You might have a scheduled limit. I don't know what everyone's situation is, but just make sure that you have the proper coverage to make sure that you have it there to pay for the operations of you being elsewhere for the right period of time. And again, thinking post-pandemic, this is taking longer to get back into facilities than it used to. We have labor shortages to think about. We have supply shortages to think about. So all of those are extending the amount of time where facilities are back up and running, which then increases the cost of the extra expense and the business income loss on that particular property occurrence. So think about those extended times when you're planning for what this backup workplace looks like for you. Make sure you've got your data files backed up in case so you know how you're going to get to your data in the event of a loss. And make sure you have a communication plan. So if your building is out and no one can call in to headquarters, how are your constituents going to know how to reach you when that is happening? And we talked about communicating with your house corporations and chapters about this in the property piece, but I think this is, again, reminding us here on property specifically. These are the times when you want to communicate with your house corporations and your chapters about these property-specific issues. We talked about summer break, talked about the winter break, beginning of the academic year, and we do have a springtime property checkup list available on our website if you want to take a look at that and use that as a jump start for things you might want to put on your checklist as well. And there's always times you want to communicate with your insurance provider. So putting communication with your insurance provider on the checklist whenever you lease, buy, renovate, or sell a property. Again, sometimes we find that out right after the fact or right before the closing happens. So the more in advance you can make that notification happen, the smoother and easier it's going to be for you or also for a house corporation. Also, when you buy or rent new equipment, you're using a lease. Oftentimes your equipment leases have a provision in there, let's say for your photocopier or your mail machine, that says you have to show evidence of coverage for that business personal property in the event of a loss. So if you are switching that lease, you're getting a new one. If you don't provide that certificate to that vendor, they might automatically start charging you for insurance as a part of your monthly bill, and you want to avoid that cost. So make sure that you've got time to get that evidence of insurance in there to those vendors so that you can avoid double paying for insurance that you don't need to pay for.
Thank you, Jennifer. And our last topic is, as we mentioned at the top, is cybersecurity liability. This is a growing area of concern for a lot of our clients, and everybody assumes that if you're using a third-party service for storage of your data, whether it be a system like Salesforce or another one, that cybersecurity is not a concern for you. We always recommend that you review those agreements with those entities to make sure who's on first, should there be a data loss or a data breach. And all of these things that we have here on the slide today are things that we've heard from our carriers out there that are providing the coverage for cybersecurity liability. One of the first ones that I'm sure most of you are familiar with is, do the employees have multi-factor authentication? It is a kind of a frustration thing when you're signing in somewhere and you have to send the text to your phone to authenticate, but it does help and prevent those individuals that do not belong to your organization getting in and stealing or using the sensitive data that you have. Speaking of sensitive data, are you allowing employees to access that sensitive information on a personal device, whether it be a cell phone, a personal laptop, maybe an iPad? And so you have to have some consideration given to whether or not those employees should have access to that data, or should it be restricted to a company device only. All of you, I'm sure, have IT consultants. You want to make sure that they're evaluating your firewalls and your other protocols basis, at least semi-annually. That is important to make sure that everything is, all the firmware and software updates are being put into place on time. And last but not least, providing training for your staff and how to identify some phishing emails. There are some great services out there that will incorporate that into the security platforms and procedures out there. They will provide that training for you. Unfortunately, we have seen claims that relate to phishing emails and payment requests. Hey, the boss is, I'm so-and-so and I'm the boss of this company, and you need to send us payment for this, and you're sending it without double checking to see if that email or that payment request was really authentic. So providing your employees training on exactly what emails they should be answering and how they're verifying some of those payment requests are important, and that process should be reviewed at least on an annual basis. So with that, that's the conclusion of our operational checklist. We covered a lot of information in about 45 minutes time. You will have access to this presentation. We'll send it out at the conclusion in PDF form that will provide all the links and everything. Is there any questions out there?
Thank you so much, Mark and Jennifer. No, we do not have any questions at this time. And Amy will go ahead and close us out.
Sure. Thank you all for attending. I also want to thank Mark and Jennifer for sharing their expertise. I think every presentation we do with them, I learned something new. So I hope you all did too. And thank Von Lehman as well for their partnership on these webinars. My name is Amy Hubler. I'm an attorney with Fraternal Partners. I think we've probably worked with many of you, but for those we haven't had the opportunity to work with, we're a law firm based in Cincinnati, Ohio, dedicated to issues impacting fraternities, sororities, student life organizations, and related charitable foundations. So we have a broad range of expertise in issues with corporate governance, real estate, housing, tax exemption, and litigation. So we'll be wrapping up this series with a legal compliance audit on October 4th. We'll focus on areas such as corporate governance and operations, legal documents that the organization should have in place and should be reviewed periodically. A couple of those Jennifer mentioned today, and maintaining your tax exempt status, which I think Lauren touched on that a bit too in the first series. So you'll see all of these will come together. And we know sometimes that you don't know what you don't know. So this is to help you with that high level review to serve as a starting point to check in on your organizations and make sure that you all are set up for success at the outset and that you're properly governing your organizations. So we'll see you on October 4th. Another shameless plug, our 2023 Fraternal Law Conference will be taking place on November 2nd and 3rd in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a great event. We have some good speakers. You can find all the details for registration on our website at fraternallaw.com. So thank you all again for coming, and thank you, Jennifer and Mark and Katie and Lauren with Von Lehman for partnering with us on these, and I hope you all learned as much as we do.